You wake up tomorrow with a fever of 103, a cough that won't stop, and no doctor, no pharmacy, no internet to search your symptoms, no painkillers, no antibiotics, not even a basic understanding of what a virus is. Just you, your body doing something you don't understand, and a group of people around you who have to decide, right now, whether to help you or leave you behind. That decision, help or leave, is one of the oldest and most consequential choices our species has ever had to make, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years. And the archaeological evidence says something surprising about which choice usually won. For most of human prehistory, getting sick or injured wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence, and not just for the individual. A sick or injured person in a small hunter-gatherer band was a mouth that still needed feeding but couldn't help gather food, couldn't help carry water, couldn't help watch for predators. In a group of 20 or 30 people living at the edge of survival, one incapacitated adult was a real strain on everyone else. From a coldly logical standpoint, abandoning the sick would have made short-term sense. And yet the fossil record is full of people who were cared for anyway, sometimes for years, in conditions that should have killed them almost immediately. The clearest evidence comes from something anthropologists call the Shanidar 1 skeleton, a Neanderthal found in a cave in what's now northern Iraq, dating back roughly 45,000 years. This individual's bones tell an extraordinary story. His right arm had been amputated above the elbow, likely decades before death. He was blind in one eye, based on damage to the skull around the eye socket. He had significant hearing loss. He had healed fractures in his leg that would have made walking difficult and painful. By any reasonable estimate, this man could not have hunted, could not have effectively defended himself, and would have struggled to keep up with a mobile group moving across rugged terrain. And yet he lived for years, likely a decade or more, after these injuries. Someone was feeding him. Someone was protecting him. Someone decided that a one-armed, partially blind, partially deaf man with a limp was still worth keeping around. This wasn't an isolated case. At a site in Vietnam called Man Bac, dating back around 4,000 years, archaeologists found the skeleton of a young man who had a condition called Klippel-Feil syndrome, which would have caused paralysis from the waist down from a very young age. He couldn't have walked. He couldn't have hunted or gathered. He lived to his early 20s in a farming community, which meant someone carried him, fed him, cleaned him, kept him alive for 2 decades with a disability that made him completely dependent on others. This is a level of sustained, unglamorous daily caregiving that we don't usually associate with prehistoric life, but the bones don't lie. At Shanidar again, a different burial revealed something else. Pollen analysis of the soil around one skeleton, Shanidar 4, initially suggested the body had been buried with flowers, an idea that captured public imagination for decades as evidence of prehistoric compassion and ritual. That specific flower burial interpretation has since been seriously challenged by researchers who argue the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents rather than deliberate placement. But even setting that particular claim aside, the pattern of deliberate burial itself, bodies positioned carefully, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes in flexed positions that clearly took effort and intention, shows up again and again at Neanderthal sites. Someone was making decisions about how to treat the dead that went beyond simply discarding a body. So how did care actually work, practically day to day? We can piece together some of it from a combination of skeletal evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies that still practice something close to the ancestral way of life. Wound care almost certainly involved cleaning injuries and packing them with materials available in the environment. There's evidence from later prehistoric sites of yarrow and other plants with mild antiseptic properties being used, and it's reasonable to think similar plant knowledge existed much earlier, passed down the same way tracking skills or tool-making skills were passed down, through direct demonstration and repetition rather than written instruction. Splinting broken bones appears to have been understood too. Several Neanderthal skeletons show healed fractures, where the bone set at an angle consistent with the limb having been immobilized during healing, rather than left to move freely, which would have produced far more severe deformities. Someone had to recognize that a broken limb needed to be kept still, find material to bind it, and then keep that person fed and protected for the weeks it takes a bone to knit back together. That's not instinct. That's knowledge, transmitted from person to person, refined over generations of trial and error, exactly the same way every other survival skill in this channel gets built up. Fever management likely involved what every human culture since has used in some form: cooling the body with water, keeping the sick person in shade or shelter, and simply waiting it out while providing food and water. This sounds almost too obvious to mention, but the obvious part is exactly the point. The fact that this basic, sensible caregiving shows up in the archaeological record at all means someone was doing it consistently enough to keep people alive through illnesses that, left untreated, kill people even today. There's also strong evidence of what researchers sometimes call the grandmother effect. The idea that postmenopausal women in ancestral human groups played an outsized role in childcare and, likely, caregiving for the sick and injured more broadly. Freed from the demands of bearing and nursing their own children, older women may have functioned as the group's accumulated medical memory, the people who remembered which plant helped with which ailment, who had seen a dozen broken bones heal and knew roughly how long it took, who had nursed sick children and sick adults through fevers before and knew what to watch for. This isn't just speculation. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies like the Hadza in Tanzania show grandmothers contributing significantly to the survival odds of their grandchildren, foraging for them, feeding them, and very likely tending them when they were sick, a pattern that plausibly stretches back much further than we can directly observe in the fossil record. Group size mattered enormously for whether this kind of care was even possible. A band of 5 or 6 people simply couldn't absorb the loss of one productive adult's labor for weeks or months without serious risk to everyone. But bands of 20, 30, sometimes larger when resources allowed, had enough slack in the system that 1 or 2 people could be dedicated to caregiving without the whole group starving. This is likely part of why humans evolved to live in these specific group sizes in the first place. A social structure that can absorb the cost of caring for its weakest members is a social structure that doesn't lose valuable knowledge, relationships, and labor every time someone gets sick or hurt. Every person who survived a serious illness because the group carried them through it was a person who could go on to have more children, teach more skills, remember more solutions to more problems. Caregiving wasn't just kindness. It was a survival strategy with a measurable payoff. It's worth being honest about the limits of this picture too. Not every sick or injured person in prehistory was cared for. Skeletal evidence, almost by definition, only shows us the people who survived long enough for their bones to heal and be found. We have essentially no way to count how many sick or injured people were left behind, abandoned, or simply couldn't be saved with the resources available. Some archaeologists caution against romanticizing what we find, pointing out that a single well-preserved skeleton like Shanidar one tells us this kind of care was possible and did happen, not that it happened for everyone, every time, in every group. The truth is probably what it usually is with prehistoric life, enormously variable, dependent on the specific people, the specific resources, the specific hardship a group was facing in a given season. But the cases we do have are still remarkable because they didn't need to exist at all. A one-armed, partially blind Neanderthal living for a decade after his injuries isn't something evolution requires. Natural selection doesn't demand compassion for the incapacitated. It would have been perfectly consistent with survival logic for that man to have been left at the last camp when the group moved on. Instead, someone carried extra weight, gathered extra food, stood extra watch, for years, for a person who could give almost nothing back in return, except, presumably, whatever value his presence, his knowledge, his relationships within the group still held. That's really the thread connecting all of this. Long before written medicine, before germ theory, before anyone understood what was actually happening inside a sick body, humans were already doing the hard, unglamorous work of keeping each other alive through illness and injury. Not because they had to, not because it was the efficient choice, but because somewhere very early in our history, groups that took care of their sick outcompeted groups that didn't, and that instinct, or maybe by then it was already a taught value, got passed down through tens of thousands of years until it became simply what humans do. So the next time you bring someone soup when they're sick, or sit with a friend through a bad flu, or carry groceries for a neighbor who can't walk right now, you're not doing something new. You're doing something Shanidar one's people were doing 45,000 years ago, in a cave, with nothing but their hands and whatever they understood about the body. For a one-armed, half-blind man who had absolutely nothing left to offer them, except the simple fact that he was still one of theirs.